Welcome everybody to this edition of the History of Christianity. We're at part 18. Today we're going to be looking at the pagan reaction to Christianity. We'll be focusing on what happened after the time of Constantine, those rulers that came after him, and one in particular who would bring the Roman Empire, or at least attempt to bring the Roman Empire back to its pagan religious roots. So let's jump into this. Constantine died in AD 337 after a long reign. He was succeeded by three of his sons, which was his plan. Constantine II ruled over Gaul, Great Britain, Spain, and Morocco. So he was the one that ruled over the western part of the empire. If you remember, that was where Constantine got his start. Constantius' territory included most of the east, so he got the east part, the part that Constantine had to go and battle over and eventually get to be emperor of the entire empire. Constans was given a strip of land between his two brothers, not as big of an area as they got, but it was a prominent area. He got Italy and he also got North Africa. Eventually, Constantius became sole emperor. However, upon the unexpected death of Constantius, his cousin Julian succeeded him. And Julian is the ruler who changed the course of events for the church. This is the guy that came along, and as we'll see, he kind of set the empire on a different path and really tried to bring back some of the old ways. He attempted to do that and certainly began the process of doing that, and we'll see how that all played out. Julian became known by the Christians as Julian the Apostate. We'll see why in just a moment. But first, the history of this. Following the death of Constantine, many of Constantine's relatives were killed, and the reason for that was so that there wouldn't be muddy water as far as the succession goes. In that time, there were definite lines of succession. The emperor would set that in motion before he passed, but there's always the possibility that some relative will come out of the woodwork with an army, try to take over. He's got some standing for that. People go along with it. So Constantine made the plans that a lot of those rivals that were of age or would soon be of age would just be killed. We see that today as being pretty cold-blooded to do that to your family, but that's the way things were done in a lot of ways back at that time. And you think of Constantine, he was the first Christian emperor, but here he is killing off people. We have to remember again, I'm not trying to say what he did was right, because it's not, but it was a different time than we live in. This is the way things often were done, and it's the way that it was done in this case. So Julian and his brother Gallus were spared, and it's probably because they were really young. They were very young boys at this time. They wouldn't have been looked at as being any kind of real imminent rivalry for the throne. Nobody's going to take a 6-year-old boy and make him emperor. But there's a possibility that down the line, one of these guys doesn't live too long, or, you're talking about a 6-year-old kid. One of these sons of Constantine rules for 10 or 15 years. Something happens to him, whatever it might be. All of a sudden, you've got one of these cousins who would then be of a good age to come in and take over, and they would be part of the family. So it was planned to allow some of the younger relatives to survive. And this is what happened with Julian and his older brother Gallus. Gallus was eventually given the title Caesar. When we think about that title, we think of Caesar. So we think of this is the guy that's in charge of everything. Well, at this time, that wasn't the case. Caesar was it was kind of like a junior emperor. He was the guy under the most powerful guy. So he wasn't in control, but he was sort of the guy that would be the next in line and could potentially be in control one day, but not yet. So he was given a lot of power. He was given a lot of authority, but he was still not the man in charge. And it was a good thing, too, because it turned out he wasn't really that good of a ruler. Constantius had him deposed and beheaded. Again, deposed, okay. Beheaded for us doesn't seem all that great. Doesn't seem like that's fair to have that kind of a punishment just because you're bad at your job. But you can't have the chance of him coming back around. I mean, at this point, he'd been in power. And yeah, he hadn't done a great job, but anybody in power at least have somebody that likes him, somebody that owes him favors, whatever. He could be a threat, and they just did not want to take a chance of having a threat around. So, unfortunately for this man, he was deposed and then beheaded. Well, all this time, Julian had gone a different route. He was not really interested in being in the ruling class at this time. When he was a young boy, he was very interested in the study of philosophy and classical literature. So Julian went to Athens. That was a seat of learning at that time. If you wanted to go and learn the classics, if you wanted to go and study philosophy, Athens was a pretty good place to go. So Julian had gone there. He was young when he went, and he had spent a lot of his time studying philosophy. Well, Julian did go to Athens, but before we get into that, let's look at their background, him and Gallus, a little bit. They were baptized and received Christian instruction, so they were, at least early on, they were considered to be Christians, and they were given Christian baptism. They were part of the church. They would have been considered to be Christians. Now, in Athens, Julian was under the influence of Basil of Caesarea. He was a devout Christian, become very prominent later on. So he was sent there knowing that there was a Christian leader there that would kind of take him under his wing. He knew him, kind of kept up with him a little bit. But in spite of that, Julian continued his philosophical studies. And as he studied more and more of the classical philosophy, classical literature of Greece, he moved away from Christianity. And he became interested in the ancient mystery religions, those pagan religions of the past. When you look at Julian, you can kind of understand why he would move away from his Christian roots. He was aware that a lot of his relatives had been killed after Constantine died. So he wasn't real crazy about that. He was also eventually going to come to know that his brother was going to be killed by one of Constantine's sons. For him, that was something that he carried with him. It was a source of bitterness. Well, what do you do if you're upset with a family member? You're going to try to get back at them in some way, even if it's only for your own personal beliefs. So, not to say that he would have been a full-fledged Christian all his life anyway. He did have a desire to study the old ways, but he saw Christianity as being associated with Constantine, his uncle, and his cousins, who had not done his family any favors. It was easy for him to leave Christianity behind as a way of saying, I renounce what you are. I renounce all of this. We can also see the point that Christianity teaches love and virtue and turning your cheek and loving your enemies. And here's Constantine, the great emperor. His sons are Christians. And what are they doing? They're killing all their enemies. They're not doing anything that Christianity teaches. It's not really that difficult to see why Julian left. He turned to the literature and religion of classical Greek. He wanted to promote that old way again. All of the teachings that were known in ancient Greece, the religions of those times that came down through the years, the pagan ways, he wanted to bring those back because that's what he found. And that is what was affirmed in his life once he left Christianity behind and really wanted to turn away from his whole family because of the way they had treated him. Constantius did not have an heir. After he got rid of Gallus, there was one other guy he could pull from because remember, all these other relatives are gone. They got rid of them. Gallus and Julian were kind of the backup plans to keep in the side pocket to call on if needed. Gallus didn't work out. So Constantius decides, okay, let's give Julian a shot. So he gets him, and Julian was given Gallus's old position. He was made Caesar and appointed to rule in Gaul, again, out in the west. Julian proved to be different from his brother. He was an exemplary ruler. He did a great job. He also proved to be a very able general in battle. He was tasked with fighting off some of the barbarians as they would try to come in and take territory from the Roman Empire. And he did a great job. He was very popular amongst the military. So he had a following there, and he did a good job leading them. Constantius, you would think, well, maybe, he would be looking at that as being a good thing. Well, he didn't. Because again, here we go. Here's a threat. Here's this guy, Julian, and he's a popular ruler, but he is getting inroads in the military. And that's something he didn't really like too much. You could probably guess that Constantius had plans when it came to Julian. They actually were going to have an armed conflict, but something happened. Constantius died unexpectedly in AD 361. Julian was already planning to march against him with his army, and when that happened, it made it even easier. So Julian marched right on in, brought his army into Constantinople, and he claimed the rule of the entire empire. And there really wasn't anybody to oppose him at that point. Constantius had taken over from his brothers. He had gotten rid of Gallus. Julian was the guy. He had the army, and now he has the entire Roman Empire. And here he is, not happy with his uncle, not happy with his cousins, and not crazy about their religion that he was brought up in. And he is definitely on the way to making some changes. So Julian takes power, and he wants to bring back the glorious old Roman Empire. We've heard that story before. In his mind, the way to do that is the way it was with some of the other emperors that came before Constantine. He wanted to restore paganism, and he needed to impede the progress of Christianity in order to do that. He knew Christianity was very popular. It was moving rapidly amongst the people. In fact, those old pagan temples had been looted. Constantine didn't, as you probably remember when we talked about him, he wasn't against paganism. In fact, he would go to their festivals. He would serve as the head of their group too. But he didn't promote them, and he actually did go through when he moved the capital of the empire to Constantinople in order to decorate that area and make his new palace and all the stuff that he wanted to do there. He went to a lot of these temples, these pagan temples, and just took out all the nice artwork and statues and that stuff. So a lot of that stuff had been taken. It had been redistributed other places. Constantine used it himself. So people had left those pagan religions. There were still people that did follow that worship, but it wasn't nearly as many. And those people they took on the role that the old Christians used to have. So they became the lower ends of society. They became very poor and didn't have a lot of things. They weren't persecuted. They didn't have that part. But they definitely had taken a step down in class. Julian wanted to reverse that, and he knew in order to do that, if he was going to get paganism going again, he had to also have a goal of impeding the progress of Christianity. But first, he wanted to get paganism back where it needed to be. So he ordered that everything that had been taken from the temples be returned. All of the artwork, all of the statues, the things that they had there, those pagan temples were restored. He brought as much of that stuff back as he could to get them back on their feet and up and running. Then he organized the pagan priesthood into a hierarchy. This was what had happened in the Christian church. And Julian, having been brought up in the Christian church, he knew the way that it was run. He knew that there was a hierarchy of people in charge, bishops, people under them, leadership. He knew that it was well run, and he wanted to mirror that in the pagan priesthood. So he did that. He divided the empire into regions, and each had its own archpriest. So this was kind of the guy that was in charge of a regional area. He was pretty high up. Then under those archpriests of each region, there was the high priest of the provinces. So all the different provinces that were located in the region each had a high priest, and those high priests answered to that archpriest of that entire region. Then the high priests were under the supreme priest, and that was Julian himself. He served in that supreme priest role to make sure that everything was going the way that he wanted it to. So they copied the hierarchy of Christianity. Then all the priests were given the admonition that they were to live an exemplary life, and they were to do acts of charity for those in need. This was something else that Julian brought from the Christian church. Your lifestyle mattering, and that you should be doing acts of charity for people. He knew that was very attractive, and he knew it was been very effective in the Christian church. He wanted his priests to do the same thing. So what we find is that though Julian rejected Christianity, he also added a great deal from it to the pagan religion. We looked at the history of Christianity, and we've seen how as time went on and Christians tried to infiltrate that pagan society, there were a lot of elements of paganism that came into the church, and not the worship of pagan gods, obviously. There was definitely the classical philosophy that very, very strongly influenced the church. Now we're seeing the opposite of that. Now Christianity is influencing the pagan religion, and they're trying to grab things out of the Christian religion to appeal to people that were Christians, to bring them back into the pagan religion. Well, you like Christianity because they do acts of service for the poor. Well, look, this is what we're doing as well. You like Christianity because it's very well run. There's a hierarchy of leadership. Well, look, here's what we've got. They're trying to mirror that. Julian really thought that would be a strong selling point. He attempted to make paganism very appealing to people so that they would want to come and be a part of it. But it didn't work all that well. Even the ones who would be involved in the pagan worship because the emperor had said that they needed to do it, they would ridicule it. They didn't take it seriously at all. They were not coming around quite the way he wanted them to. So Julian realized it's not just enough for me to try to build up paganism. I've got to try to tear down Christianity as well. He wanted to bring hindrance to Christianity. And he took a series of measures in order to do that. Now, one thing we can say for Julian, he never brought persecution back. When Constantine came in, if you'll remember, that was the end of persecution in the Roman Empire for Christianity, and that's the case. Julian never tries to persecute them. There were some martyrs at this time, but it would be regional people, disputes, some individual might kill a Christian. It was never government sanctioned. There was never any idea that Christianity was being outlawed or that anybody in Christianity was to be punished as an act of the government. So he never did that, but he definitely wanted to hinder Christianity in its growth. He passed laws forbidding Christians to teach classical literature. You may be wondering, well, why is the big deal with that? Well, remember that this was one of the big ways Christians had always gotten inroads in with the people of their time. They would appeal to that classical literature. They would find points that they felt like intersected with Christian theology, teachings in the Bible. Even if they weren't really all that great of an intersection, they'd find them. And they would go to people and say, okay, you believe Plato said this? Well, let me show you what Jesus said. Doesn't that sound just like Plato? The same teachings that this guy had, you find with us. And it was a way of having a point of connection with people that were outside the church. And Julian knew this. He was raised as a Christian. He knew how things worked from the inside. And so he thought, okay, if I've stopped this avenue of Christians being able to continue to get out there and draw people in, then that's going to hinder them. And obviously that was the case. It did hinder them. Julian also directly attacked Christianity. He wrote a work called Against the Galileans. And in that work, he mocked the Bible and the teachings of Jesus. Because he was raised as a Christian, he knew the teachings of the church very well. When we look back and see the old pagan ways of thinking about Christianity, they were mostly misunderstandings. They didn't understand communion. They didn't understand the teachings of the church. They thought that Christians were atheists because they didn't have actual statues that they worshiped. They didn't have visible gods. Julian didn't have any of those problems. Julian knew Christianity very well. And so he was able to attack it at the points that he thought it was weakest because he knew it from the inside out. And that's very effective. If you want to attack a group's thoughts, you need to know what they think. You need to understand it very well. You need to submerge yourself in it. And the more you know, the easier it is because you can find the little points of weakness. You can find those points that people are not quite sure about, or the theological positions were in dispute. They weren't universally agreed on, or they were just not the strongest arguments. Julian knew those, and he wrote this work to attack Christianity, and he did that. He mocked the Bible, he mocked the teachings of Jesus. Then Julian did something else. He had the temple in Jerusalem rebuilt as a rebuttal of the Christian argument that the destruction of the temple had been the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. Christians had said that was one thing you could point to, that the old way had passed, there was a new time. Old Testament prophecy was fulfilled because the temple was destroyed. Well, Julian said, well, I'll show them, I'll just rebuild it. And they can't say that anymore. Just another way to try to attack their credibility. And he went so far as to having the temple in Jerusalem rebuilt. Not because he loved the Jews, not because he wanted their worship to continue to go on. He didn't really care about one way or the other. He just wanted to attack Christianity to make it weaker so that he could prop up the pagan ways and get people to come back to paganism. But then something happened. He had not been emperor very long, just a few years, and Julian died unexpectedly in AD 363 during a military campaign against the Persians when he was fatally wounded by an enemy spear. He had led armies into battle successfully. He was a good general. But when you go out like that, you take the chance you could be injured. And he wasn't just injured, he was killed. And that put a stop to it. Imagine if Julian had stayed alive and he had ruled for 10, 20, 30 years. We might be looking at a whole lot different world today. With the practices that he had put into place, with the backing of the empire And because he did know Christianity very well from the inside out, it's very likely Julian could have gained a lot of traction and been very effective in trying to move people away from Christianity. But it didn't happen that way because he didn't live long enough. So there wasn't the big push back to paganism. It never really took hold. It could have if it had been given enough time, but thankfully it did not. So that ended his campaign of restoration of the pagan religion. It ended right there, and his fight against Christianity. So that was Julian. You may be thinking, well, I don't know how significant that is to look at him. Well, it is very significant because we'll see as we go through this study, it did cause some problems for the Christians, and it also made them have to do some different things. We'll look at that next week as well, because we're going to get back into the Arian controversy. That controversy should have been settled at the Council of Nicaea, but it wasn't because of Constantine and his possible relative, or at least a person who's very influential, Eusebius, who came in and really sold Constantine on going back to the Arian belief system rather than what the council had decided. We'll look a little bit at what Constantine's sons did. There were 3 of them, and they didn't all have the same view about it. And then we'll look and see how now the church has to deal with Arianism. They thought they had it settled, but they didn't, and it's going to cause problems for a long time. They've got to fight this off, though. You can't have the Christian church believing and teaching that Jesus is not divine. It does not work. It will never work. Others have come along through the years and tried to do the exact same thing. There are people today doing the same thing. It will not work in Christianity. It's not the teachings that were passed down from Jesus himself and then to his followers, the apostles, and on to their disciples and on through the line of succession through the church. That's one thing, but then it's not true. It's not factual. Jesus is God. He's not different than God. He's not a created being. He is God himself. So this fight went on. And next week we're going to see one of the prominent leaders in the church that fought very strongly against Arianism. He was actually there at the Council of Nicaea. I don't think we mentioned him at all last week intentionally. We'll go back and look at his role there. He didn't have a huge role yet, but he was there for everything that happened. And he became the one that brought forth the battle against Arianism. Very important figure. You'll learn about him next week. I think you'll really enjoy that, as well as we see how the church continues to change and be challenged through the years and try to nail down theological positions, doctrinal positions that the church can agree on, so that heresy cannot come into the church and cannot destroy the teaching that had been passed down. We'll look at that next week. Hope that you'll be able to come back for that again. Thank you so much for spending time listening to this today. This was a little bit shorter one. I think those are always good every now and then, just so you don't get tired of listening too long. Have a blessed week. Thanks for being here today.